Hi there, I'm Ashley with Mama Needs a Manual. Welcome to day 3 of the Ultimate Tantrum Survival Guide. So we've talked about days 1 and 2, and it's an acronym. So T stands for training versus discipline, and A is for acknowledge feelings. So if you missed those, you can catch them on the blog. Today we're going to be talking about N, which is natural consequences. So I feel like as soon as I entered into the world of parenting, I entered into this world of sometimes extremes and a lot of fear on either side of those extremes. Like we have the breastfeeding moms over here, and we have the formula feeding moms over here, and we have the natural birth moms over here, and we have the C-section moms over here. And when it comes to sleep training, well, we have the very scheduled, rigid moms over here, and then we have the fly by the seat of their pants, feed the baby whenever they cry moms over here, and don't ever put the baby down, wear them all the time, co-sleep, all those things. We have these extremes, and I say this from a very loving heart. I see validity on many sides of those extremes. I have friends that are all over the spectrum. I myself have been all over the spectrum with my 3 different boys in the last 3.5 years or so. So these messages come from a place of grace and no judgment. Do whatever works best for you and your family. So when it comes to consequences, I felt like a lot of times the first thing that popped into my mind when I thought of consequences was spankings. Because I've heard of this before, and I thought, okay, maybe spankings work, maybe they don't, I don't know. I have friends, again, that don't spank their children and think that it's horrible, and I have other friends who think spanking is the only way to go. Again, you want to do what's effective for you and your family within reason, and of course, there's no abuse in the situation. And on the other hand, you have like the timeout moms, right? Where timeout is key. And so you may have a chair that you sit your kid in, or maybe you put them in your crib, even though some people say it's not okay to put your kid in the crib. There's all these shoulds and should nots. And almost sometimes it's just overwhelming, honestly, to figure out where you stand and what is best for you and your kid. And that's where, for me, prayer and wisdom and asking God's guidance comes in to figure out what works best. Gentle is the least force necessary. And so sometimes what works well for one kid might just be looking at them and saying, no, don't do that. Maybe that brings them to tears. For another kid, it might be that you have to force them more so to obey. And so, again, there's a spectrum. There's no judgment coming from me at all. These are all just ideas for you to practice at home, some things that have helped with our family at different times. So N stands for natural consequences. So let me tell you a little story. It's about Adam and Eve in the garden. So God put a tree in the middle of the garden that Adam and Eve were not allowed to eat from, but they could eat from any other tree, right? So they had a lot of good choices and one wrong choice. So he could have not put the tree in the garden at all. He could have had no temptation, but he chose to put the temptation in the midst of the garden. And they had to learn from that the hard way. And we all suffer consequences from them taking that fruit, right? So there's this idea when it comes to teaching our kids that sometimes we just need to remove all the scary things. And don't get me wrong, there's a place for that. I have, safety locks on my knife drawer, and all our outlets are covered. There's locks on the doors. If you're kicking open the door, make sure there's a lock up high, safety around your swimming pool. I'm all for safety, okay? But there's a balance between removing temptation at all and then letting your kid experience failure, okay? So sometimes it's good to put the temptation there, to let our kid have to learn what no means and to have to learn what self-control is. So when you think about natural consequences, the idea is give your child the opportunity to fail when appropriate and to learn from that failure. Okay, this is where the wisdom comes in and the discernment, because there's kids of all different ages here. And of course, I don't want my child to learn from falling way up high that he might break his neck. That's too scary. But maybe he can learn from a different situation where there's not as high stakes when it comes to consequences. So maybe you can kind of even engineer a natural consequence. For instance, if your kids are not playing rightly with a toy, if they're hitting each other with it or they're not sharing, you can say, well, I guess the toy needs to go to timeout. So we have lots of toys on our refrigerator right now that are in timeout. So your child has learned if they don't play with a toy correctly, then kind of like the natural consequence is that they don't get to play with the toy anymore. Instead of thinking about solely timeout or spankings, you can think of removing a privilege if they misabuse that privilege. Another example would be if you're trying to teach your kids to clean up their toys and they leave their toys out all over the ground the next day. Maybe mommy and daddy hid the toys and they don't get to play with them that day because they didn't clean up their toys. Then as the child gets older, this gets harder, I'm sure, as a parent. Say that your child leaves their homework on the kitchen counter and they're like in 7th grade and you see the homework. You can either rescue your child and bring the homework up to school for them, or you can let your child experience the ramifications of their choice, right? Which would hopefully be they would fail that assignment, or they would get a discount for points taken off for turning that assignment in late, right? If we rescue our child from every failure when the stakes are small, then they won't learn how to succeed in this world, right? There's consequences for choices and there's consequences for actions. So I hope that my children learn from their small failures so that hopefully they won't make huge failures that could be honestly costing their life as they get older. And this is why I hated the retest policy so much when I was a teacher. My students knew I hated it a lot. I think there's a time for redoing, and I'll talk about that actually with the letter R. But when it comes to letting you retest and have no consequences whatsoever, and you failed a test, you get to take it over again up to 100. I just don't think that's teaching anyone lifelong lessons. So the idea here is let your child fail and learn from those consequences. They take ownership and responsibility in that way because our goal is for them to grow up to be adults, right? Responsible adults who can decide for themselves right and wrong and have this intrinsic motivation to do good. Along with this comes the 4 stages of parenting, which I heard at our church actually recently, and I thought that they were great, and so I just thought I would mention them here. So the idea is, first, you're your child's caregiver. Have a diaper as our object lesson. So it starts off caregiver from about age 0 to 5. All you're doing all day long is taking care of their basic needs, right? Changing diapers, wiping noses, keeping them safe, feeding them, teaching them yes, right, and wrong, and starting to discipline them. But you have this primarily role as caregiver in the beginning, offering lots of hugs and kisses and connecting time. And then you have cop, which I have Sheriff here. He's very well loved in our house. So the next stage is cop, and that's from ages 6 to 11 or so, like elementary school. And trying to teach your kids what is right and what is wrong and how to start making those choices on their own. So in this stage, you might still be rescuing them if they forget their homework, and sometimes that might be, I might rescue my child in that situation. I'm saying you don't need to never do that, but think about sometimes letting your child experience the consequences for their choices and not trying to rescue them all the time. So we have the cop, which is like helping them to learn right from wrong and telling them, hey, you shouldn't do this, and maybe you should do this, and it's polite when you ask this way, and all those things. And then we have the coach, which is adolescence, okay, up into age 18. So hopefully in this season, when they're in high school, middle school and high school, you're starting to kind of let them go out on their own, but still coaching them, right, from the sidelines. You're still there. You're still kind of like, if you think about like the bumpers on a bowling alley, you're still there. You're still kind of guiding, and you're coaching and encouraging them along the way. And then once they leave your home, you're a consultant, okay? Here's my little consultant hat, dude. And in that stage, you do not give advice, which has to be really hard as a parent of a child that is 19, 20, 21. You do not give advice unless asked. That's the goal, is to become a consultant and hopefully a friend to your child. Once they reach a certain age, it's hard for kids to receive advice when they don't ask, because once they're an adult, they're trying to make their own choices. And so you really want to try to pull back some in that stage and let your child make his or her own choices. And so this is the idea. Natural consequences can be a very creative tool of discipline. And so they can help, it's not so much tantrum specifically, but discipline as a whole. just having this extra tool. So you don't have to only think about timeouts and spankings when it comes to what can I do when my child misbehaves, but you can also think, how can I turn this situation into a learning opportunity, right? How can I help them learn from this experience? And so maybe sometimes they learn don't touch the hot water because it's hot, and they actually just touched it, and that was enough. You don't have to then further discipline them for learning from that mistake. Again, it depends on the parent, it depends on the child and the personalities in play. One thing I wanted to go back and talk about one more time. The garden, right? The consequences of this forbidden fruit is death. And ultimately, we all die. That's a fact. And so I really want my kids to learn about natural consequences and to learn about the idea of choices having consequences, because that sets up their hearts to hear the gospel. They realize they can't always obey, and they realize they need someone to help them, because how good is good enough? We all make mistakes. None of us are perfect. We might think about Hitler on one extreme and we're not as bad as Hitler, or we might think about Mother Teresa on the other extreme and think, well, we're not as good as Mother Teresa, or Billy Graham, but where do I fall, and is that good enough? And ultimately, none of us are good. None of us are perfect, and we need Jesus to save us. And so I want to set that up for my children. And so the idea behind discipline is that we discipline our children because we love them, and we want them to understand the idea of, when I choose this, I have consequences. And so when we choose sin, the consequence is death. But Jesus, right? If we have Jesus, then we have life. And so that's kind of the heart behind this idea, the heart behind teaching our children consequences. It can have a much deeper meaning. And so I hope that you find that helpful. And again, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great day. Bye.